Hidden recording exposes fake dad's evil plan. Foster child's life saved. The wiretap recording was crystal clear. Grace's custody is essential for brand continuation and long-term financial planning. Estimated revenue, $3.2 million. These weren't the words of a loving father seeking reunion with his daughter. They were the cold calculations of a predator who saw 10-year-old Grace Martinez as a business opportunity. For months, Marcus Sterling had played the role of reformed addict and devoted father, complete with celebrity endorsements and media appearances. His custody battle against Grace's foster family had captivated the nation. But Officer Sarah Thompson's secret investigation had uncovered the truth. Sterling's sobriety was fake. His witnesses were paid to lie, and his love for Grace was nothing more than financial calculation. This is the incredible story of how one police officer's determination and a little girl's courage exposed a shocking fraud and saved a family from destruction. The truth was more horrifying than anyone imagined. The first thing Grace noticed every morning wasn't the gentle streaming of sunlight through the hand-sewn curtains, though Maria had spent 3 evenings carefully hemming the pink fabric with tiny, perfect stitches. It wasn't even the sound of Carlos humming off-key in the kitchen below, his voice cracking on the high notes of some half-remembered ballad from his youth. No, the first thing that filled Grace's consciousness each morning was the absence of fear. For 10 years, she had awakened to uncertainty. Would there be breakfast? Would the foster parents be in a good mood? Would today be the day she'd have to pack her few belongings into the battered suitcase that had followed her through 7 different homes? But here, in this modest bedroom painted the exact shade of pink she'd shyly mentioned liking during her first week, Grace woke to the revolutionary experience of knowing what came next. She stretched beneath the quilt Maria had found at a garage sale and transformed with colorful patches, each one telling a story of their growing family. The yellow sunflower patch came from Grace's first successful attempt at gardening. The blue denim square was cut from Carlos's old work shirt, the one he'd torn teaching Grace to ride a bike in the driveway. His patient voice calling, "I've got you 100," even as she wobbled toward the inevitable crash into the hedge. Downstairs, the symphony of morning love played its familiar tune, the gentle sizzle of pancake batter hitting the griddle, the soft thump of Maria's footsteps as she laid out Grace's school clothes. Always chosen the night before, always clean, always exactly the right size. "Hear about your spelling test. Love, Maria." She'd folded it carefully and tucked it into her backpack pocket, alongside 6 other notes she couldn't bear to throw away. "Grace, breakfast." Carlos's voice carried up the stairs, warm with affection and completely free of the impatience that had colored so many mornings in other homes. She bounded down the stairs, her feet knowing exactly which step creaked, the 4th one from the top, and which banister post was loose. Maria kept meaning to ask Carlos to fix it, but Grace secretly loved how it wiggled under her hand. The kitchen embraced her with the scent of vanilla and cinnamon, Carlos's secret ingredients that made his pancakes famous throughout the Martinez extended family. "There she is," Carlos beamed, flipping a pancake with the theatrical flair that never failed to make Grace giggle. "My sous chef is ready for another day of conquering the world." Grace slid into her chair, the one with the slightly wobbly leg that Carlos had promised to fix tomorrow for the past 6 months. She loved that wobble now. It was hers, Everything about this kitchen was becoming hers in ways she'd never experienced before. The way Maria hummed while braiding Grace's hair, her fingers gentle and patient, never pulling too hard even when Grace's curls tangled rebelliously. The way Carlos always made exactly 3 pancakes, one for each member of their family, and how he'd started asking if she wanted chocolate chips or blueberries instead of just assuming. "Today feels special," Grace announced, surprising herself with the declaration. Maria's hands paused in her hair. "Oh, what makes you say that, Hart?" Grace considered this, trying to put into words the feeling that had been growing stronger each morning. In her previous foster homes, she'd learned to make herself invisible, to take up as little space as possible, to need nothing. But here, she was learning something entirely different. She was learning that she could take up space. She could have opinions about pancakes and preferences about hair ribbons. She could leave her drawings on the refrigerator and know they'd still be there tomorrow. "I don't know," she said finally. "It just does." Carlos placed a perfect golden pancake in front of her, cut into the shape of a star. "Special days call for special pancakes, don't you think?" As Grace poured syrup carefully around each point of her star, she caught sight of her reflection in the kitchen window. The girl looking back at her was different from the hollow-eyed child who'd arrived 18 months ago. This girl's cheeks were full and rosy. Her hair was shiny and neatly braided. Her eyes, Grace leaned closer to the window. Her eyes were bright with something she was only beginning to recognize as hope. "Come on, 100, Maria said, gathering Grace's backpack and lunch. To mouth, the sweetness lingering on her tongue as she hugged Carlos goodbye. His embrace was firm and real, the kind of hug that said, "I'll be here when you get back," without needing words. Maria's hug was softer, scented with the vanilla lotion she used, and accompanied by a whispered, "Have the most wonderful day, my brave girl." At the front door, Grace paused to look back at the kitchen where Carlos was already washing dishes, still humming his off-key song. The morning light caught the steam rising from the sink, creating tiny rainbows in the air. This was home, she realized. Not just the house, not just the room with pink curtains and a wobbly chair. Home was this feeling, this certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. She didn't know that in less than a week, a phone call would shatter this perfect morning routine. She didn't know that a man she barely remembered would emerge from the shadows to claim ownership of her happiness. For now, there was just this, Maria's hand warm in hers, the weight of a carefully packed lunch in her backpack, and the absolute certainty that at 3:15 p.m., someone who loved her would be waiting at the school gate. Lincoln Elementary buzzed with the particular energy of a Wednesday morning in October, when the leaves were just beginning to turn, and the promise of Halloween made every lesson feel more exciting. Grace Martinez almost pushed through the familiar red doors with a confidence that would have been unimaginable just 2 years ago. "Grace, Grace, wait up!" Lily Chen's voice cut through the hallway chatter, her dark ponytail bouncing as she hurried to catch up with her best friend. In her arms, she clutched a poster board covered in carefully drawn pictures of the solar system. "Did you remember your spelling words?" Lily asked breathlessly, falling into step beside Grace as they navigated toward Mrs. Rodriguez's third-grade classroom. Grace patted her backpack with satisfaction. "I practiced them with Carlos last night. He made up this silly song about refrigerator that I can't get out of my head." She hummed a few bars of Carlos's improvised tune, causing Lily to dissolve into giggles. The sound of her own laughter still surprised Grace sometimes. For so many years, laughter had felt dangerous, too loud, too noticeable, too likely to draw the wrong kind of attention. But here at Lincoln Elementary, where she'd spent the last year and a half, laughter was safe. Mrs. Rodriguez smiled when her students laughed. The principal, Mr. Morrison, had a joke for every child he passed in the hallway. Even the lunch lady seemed to enjoy the chaos of 200 children trying existence in a bad way. This was the good kind of nervous, the kind that came from caring about something and daring to hope for success. She approached Mrs. Rodriguez's desk, trying to read the teacher's expression. Mrs. Rodriguez was young for a teacher, probably close to Maria's age, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a collection of cardigan sweaters that seemed to grow more colorful as the seasons changed. Today's was orange with tiny pumpkins embroidered along the collar. "I'm very proud of you, Grace," Mrs. Rodriguez said softly, turning over the test paper. At the top, written in red ink, was a perfect A+, followed by a small smiley face. Grace's breath caught in her throat. An A+. She'd never received an A+ on anything before. In her previous schools, she'd been too distracted by hunger, too anxious about where she'd be living next week, too focused on survival to excel academically. Teachers had labeled her behind grade level and difficult to engage. Some had looked at her with pity, others frustrated. But Mrs. Rodriguez had seen something different from the very first day. Grace had arrived at Lincoln Elementary, clutching Maria's hand and fighting tears. She'd seen a child who was smart but scared, capable but traumatized. And she decided to nurture the smart and capable while gently healing the scared and traumatized. Can I show Lily?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course you can. And Grace," Mrs. Rodriguez leaned closer, "your handwriting has improved so much. I can tell you've been practicing at home." Grace nodded eagerly. "Maria sits with me every night after dinner. She has this special pencil grip that makes it easier." She held up her right hand, demonstrating the proper grip that Maria had patiently taught her, night after night, never showing frustration when Grace's letters came out backward, or her words ran together. "Lily!" Grace called out, practically dancing back to her friend's desk. "Look!" Lily's eyes widened as she saw the grade. "Grace! That's amazing! We have to celebrate!" She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "My mom packed extra cookies for my lunch. We can share them during recess." As the morning progressed, Grace found herself participating in class discussions with a confidence that surprised even her. When Mrs. Rodriguez asked about the water cycle, Grace's hand shot up. When they worked on math problems, she volunteered to solve one on the board. During reading time, she chose a chapter book instead of the picture books she used to hide behind. The transformation wasn't lost on Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been teaching for 8 years and had seen too many children, like Grace, bright souls, dimmed by circumstances beyond their control. In Grace's file, she kept notes documenting the remarkable change. September 2022. Performance now above grade level. At lunch, Grace and Lily sat at their usual table near the window, overlooking the playground. Grace unpacked her lunch with the same quiet reverence she brought to this ritual every day. The sandwich, turkey and cheese with just a little mustard the way she liked it. An apple, cut into slices to prevent browning, with a small container of peanut butter for dipping. A juice box, never the cheap kind that tasted like sugar water, and today's note. "What does it say today?" Lily asked. She'd become fascinated. Another chance to raise her hand in class. Another lunch with a note from Maria. The routine that had once felt foreign, now felt as natural as breathing. "See you tomorrow, Grace," Lily called out as she headed toward her mother's car. "See you tomorrow," Grace called back, shouldering her backpack and walking toward the fence, where Maria stood waiting, her face lighting up the moment she spotted Grace. "How did the spelling test go, Heart?" Maria asked, opening her arms for the daily after-school hug. Grace pulled the test from her backpack with flourish. "A+," she announced. Maria's delighted gasp and proud embrace were worth every hour of practice, every moment of believing that she was capable of success. As they walked toward the car, Grace chatted about her day. The art project, the cookies Lily shared, the book she wanted to check out from the library. She didn't notice the black sedan that had been parked across from the school for the past 3 days, or the man inside taking photos with a telephoto lens. She didn't see him following at a discreet distance as Maria drove toward home, talking animatedly about stopping for ice cream to celebrate the perfect spelling test. For now, there was just this, the warmth of success, the security of being picked up on time, and the absolute certainty that tonight there would be celebration, encouragement, and the kind of love that makes children believe they can conquer the world. The Martinez living room had transformed into what Carlos jokingly called Homework Central by the time evening shadows began creeping across the worn but comfortable furniture. Grace sat at the kitchen table, which had been cleared of dinner dishes and now served as a makeshift desk, her math workbook spread open beside a pencil case that Maria had decorated with Grace's name in glittery letters. "Okay, 100, Carlos said, settling into the chair beside her, with his reading glasses perched on his nose. "Let's tackle these multiplication problems. Remember what we learned about making groups?" Grace nodded, but her attention kept drifting to the kitchen, where Maria was preparing tomorrow's lunch, with the methodical care of someone who understood that consistency was a form of love. The soft sounds of domestic life, the gentle hum of the refrigerator, the whistle of the kettle heating water for Carlos's evening tea, the rustle of wax paper being torn from its roll, created a symphony of belonging that Grace was still learning to trust. 7 times 8, Carlos read from the workbook. "Can you show me the blocks?" As Grace arranged the colorful counting blocks into groups, she found herself thinking about permanence. How long did happiness last? In her experience, good things had expiration dates. Foster families who decided she was too much work. Caseworkers who... This felt different. Carlos helped with homework every night, even when he came home tired from his job at the auto shop, his hands still stained with engine grease despite scrubbing. Maria read bedtime stories even when Grace could read perfectly well on her own, understanding that the ritual wasn't about literacy, it was about connection. They included her in decisions about weekend plans, asked her opinion about dinner menus, and had hung her artwork on the refrigerator beside grocery lists and appointment reminders, as if her creations were equally important. 56, Grace announced, counting the final group of blocks. Perfecto, Carlos beamed, making a note in the margin. You're getting so good at this. Soon you'll be helping me figure out measurements for my workshop projects. The phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the peaceful evening atmosphere. Maria dried her hands on a dish towel and reached for the cordless phone hanging on the kitchen wall. Martinez residence, she answered in her warm, slightly accented English. Grace watched Maria's face change as she listened to the caller. The smile faded, replaced by focused attention, then concern. Maria turned slightly away, lowering her voice. But Grace had learned to read body language long before she'd mastered multiplication tables. Mrs. Chen, Maria said. Yes, we can talk now. Carlos is here too. Carlos and Grace exchanged glances. Mrs. Chen was their adoption attorney, a kind woman with silver hair and an office filled with photos of children she'd helped unite with forever families. Grace had met her several times, had answered questions about her feelings and her wishes for the future. Mrs. Chen had explained the legal process in terms Grace could understand, had promised that soon, very soon, Grace would legally become Grace Martinez. "What's the update?" Maria asked, gesturing for Carlos to join her in the kitchen. "The paperwork is ready?" Grace pretended to focus on her math problems, but every fiber of her being was tuned to the conversation happening 10 feet away. She heard Maria's sharp intake of breath, saw Carlos reach for his wife's hand. "Just final signatures needed," Maria repeated, her voice rising with excitement. "By next Friday?" Grace's pencil stilled on her workbook. Next Friday. In less than a week, she would officially become their daughter. Not their foster child, not their placement, but their daughter. The word felt too big, too wonderful, too impossible to be real. "Grace?" Carlos called softly. "Come here, 100. Mrs. Chen wants to speak with you." Grace approached the phone with the mixture of hope and terror that had become familiar whenever adults wanted to discuss her future. Too many conversations had ended with news of moves, changes. "Exciting news. All your paperwork has been approved by the court. Judge Walsh just needs to review the final documents, and then we can schedule your adoption ceremony. How does that sound?" Grace's knees felt weak. "Really? Is it really happening?"
It's really happening. Next Friday afternoon, you'll officially become Grace Martinez. How do you feel about that?
Grace looked up at Carlos and Maria, who were watching her with expressions of joy and anticipation that mirrored her own emotions.
I feel like I'm going to cry, but in a good way.
Miss Chen's gentle laughter carried through the phone.
Those are the very best kind of tears, Grace. I'll call your parents tomorrow with the specific time and details. For now, just enjoy this moment.
After hanging up, the three of them stood in the kitchen, arms wrapped around each other, in a group hug that felt like the culmination of 18 months of careful trust building. Grace breathed in the scent of Maria's vanilla lotion and Carlos's aftershave, trying to memorize this moment when her dream finally became reality.
My daughter.
Maria whispered into Grace's hair.
My beautiful, brave daughter.
Next Friday, Carlos added, his voice thick with emotion.
We'll have a party, a real celebration.
As bedtime approached, the evening routine felt especially precious. Maria ran Grace a bath with extra bubbles, a luxury that Grace had learned to appreciate after years of quick showers in overcrowded foster homes.
Carlos picked out pajamas, the soft cotton ones with tiny stars that Maria had sewn patches on when they developed holes. Because in this house, favorite things were repaired rather than discarded.
What story tonight?
Maria asked, settling into the chair beside Grace's bed with their current book, Charlotte's Web.
The chapter where Wilbur finds out Charlotte is his friend.
Grace requested. It was her favorite part, the moment when Wilbur realizes he's not alone, that someone cares about his welfare and wants to protect him. As Maria read aloud, Grace studied the familiar room that would soon legally be hers. The pink walls that Maria had painted during Grace's second week, after shyly admitting that pink was her favorite color. The bookshelf that Carlos had built and painted white. now filled with books they'd chosen together at the library and the bookstore. The dresser was topped with a jewelry box, empty except for a friendship bracelet from Lily, and a framed photo from Grace's school picture day. The first school photo where she was genuinely smiling.
Can I legally change my name to Grace Martinez soon?
Grace, a faithful stuffed rabbit who had been her companion through every placement, every move, every frightening new beginning. "We made it, Mr. Buttons," she whispered, holding the worn toy close to her chest. "We finally found our forever family." Through her bedroom window, she could see the lights of the neighborhood. Other families settling in for the night, other children safe in their beds. Soon, she would be one of them completely. Not a temporary visitor, not a child in transition, but Grace Martinez, daughter of Carlos and Maria, student at Lincoln Elementary, friend of Lily Chen, member of a family that chose her and kept choosing her every single day. She fell asleep planning next Friday's celebration, imagining the moment when Judge Walsh would make it official, when she could introduce herself as Grace Martinez without qualification or explanation. In her dreams, she was surrounded by love, security, and the absolute certainty that she would never have to pack her belongings into a battered suitcase again. She didn't dream about the man who had spent the day researching her location, or the legal papers being prepared that would challenge everything she'd come to believe about her future. For tonight, there was only joy, anticipation, and the profound peace that comes from knowing you are exactly where you belong. The Martinez house settled into quiet contentment, its 3 occupants secure in their shared happiness, unaware that forces beyond their control were already in motion to destroy the life they had so carefully built together. The aroma of Maria's homemade enchiladas filled the Martinez dining room as the family gathered around their small oak table for what should have been another peaceful Tuesday evening. Grace sat in her usual spot, the chair with the slightly loose leg that Carlos kept promising to fix tomorrow, carefully cutting her enchilada into precise squares the way she'd learned to eat in foster homes where food was scarce and had to be savored slowly. Carlos was mid-story about a particularly stubborn carburetor he'd battled at the shop when the phone's shrill ring sliced through the comfortable evening chatter. Maria glanced at the clock on the wall, 7:30 p.m., an unusual time for social calls. Grace watched as Maria wiped her hands on her apron and reached for the cordless phone, her face showing mild curiosity rather than concern. "Martinez residence," Maria answered in her warm, slightly musical voice. The change was instantaneous and terrifying. Grace had learned to read adult expressions with the survival instincts of a child who'd never been able to count on stability, and what she saw on Maria's face made her stomach clench with familiar dread. The color drained from Maria's cheeks, her eyes widened, and her free hand gripped the edge of the kitchen counter until her knuckles turned white. "Miss Chen," Maria's voice. Grace's fork clattered against her plate as her hands began to tremble. She knew that tone, the careful, controlled way adults spoke when delivering news that would shatter a child's world. She'd heard it when her first foster mother explained that Grace would be moving to a better-suited family. She'd heard it when her caseworker announced that the Hendersons had decided to take in a younger child instead. She'd heard it in a dozen different voices, in a dozen different settings, but always with the same underlying message. You don't belong here anymore. "A custody petition?" Maria repeated, her voice rising an octave. "Filed by whom?" Carlos dropped his own fork, his attention now completely focused on his wife's increasingly distressed conversation. Grace felt the familiar sensation of the world tilting off its axis, the same dizzy unreality that had preceded every major disruption in her young life. His biological father, Maria's words hit Grace like physical blows. But we were told there was no father listed on 3 days before the adoption? Grace's breathing became shallow and rapid. The enchilada on her plate blurred as tears filled her eyes, and she could hear her own voice asking the questions that had haunted her through 7 foster placements. Do I have to leave? Do I have to pack? Are you sending me away? The questions tumbled out in a panicked rush, each one higher pitched than the last. Do I have to leave? Do I have to pack my things? Did I do something wrong? Are you mad at me? Do I have to go back to Ms. Johnson? I'll be good, I promise I'll be better. Please don't make me leave. Carlos was out of his chair instantly, his strong arms wrapping around Grace's shaking shoulders as Maria continued her increasingly frantic conversation with their attorney. No, 100, no. Carlos whispered fiercely into Grace's hair. You're not going anywhere. You're our daughter, and we're going to fight for you. But Grace had heard similar promises before, and experience had taught her that adults' assurances often crumbled under legal pressures and bureaucratic complications. Her hyperventilation worsened, each breath coming in short, desperate gasps that made her chest tight and her vision spotty. Grace, breathe with me, Carlos instructed, his voice steady despite the fear Grace could see in his eyes. In through your nose, out through your mouth, just like we practiced during your nightmares. You're safe. You're here with us. Maria hung up the phone with shaking hands and immediately joined them, sinking to her knees beside Grace's chair. Listen to me, Hart, she said, taking Grace's face in her hands. A man who says he's your biological father has filed papers with the court, but that doesn't mean anything is decided. Ms. Chen is going to fight this. We're going to fight this. You are our daughter in every way that matters. But what if the judge makes me go with him, Grace sobbed, her carefully constructed sense of security crumbling like a house of cards. What if he takes me away from you? I don't even know him. I don't want to know him. The 3 of them moved to the living room couch, Grace sandwiched between Carlos and Maria, their arms creating a protective barrier around her trembling form. The enchiladas grew cold on the dining room table, forgotten in the face of crisis. Let me explain what's happening, Maria said gently, using the same patient tone she employed when helping Grace with difficult homework. Sometimes, when a child is about to be adopted, biological parents who haven't been involved in their life decide they want to be involved. It doesn't mean they'll get what they want. It just means the court has to listen to what they have to say. But I don't want him to have anything to say about me, Grace cried. I don't know him. He never came to see me, never sent birthday cards, never anything. Carlos's jaw tightened with barely controlled anger. This man, he said carefully, has no right to disrupt our family now. Miss Chen says he's never paid child support, never requested visitation, never shown any interest in you until 3 days before our adoption was supposed to be finalized. That tells us something about his motivations. Grace looked up at Carlos with red-rimmed eyes. What does that mean? What motivations? Maria and Carlos exchanged a look over Grace's head, communicating in the silent language of parents trying to protect their child from adult complexities. It means, Maria said slowly, that we don't think he really cares about being your father. We think he might have other reasons for doing this. What other reasons? Grace pressed, her survival instincts demanding she understand the threat facing her newfound happiness. We don't know yet, 100, Carlos admitted. But we're going to find out, and no matter what his reasons are, no matter what he wants, we're not going to let anyone take you away from us. You belong here. You belong with us. As the evening wore on, the family remained huddled together on the couch, Grace gradually calming under the steady reassurance of the 2 people who had become her anchor in an uncertain world. But even as her breathing returned to normal and her tears dried, a cold knot of fear had settled in her stomach, the familiar terror of a child who had learned that safety was always temporary, and that the adults who claimed to love her might not have the power to keep her safe. Outside, unbeknownst to the grieving family, A black sedan sat parked at the end of their quiet street, its occupant making phone calls and taking notes, preparing for a media campaign that would turn their private anguish into public spectacle. The first news van arrived at 6:47 a.m. on Wednesday morning, its satellite dish extending like a metallic flower reaching toward the gray October sky. Grace spotted it from her bedroom window, a vehicle parked directly across from the Martinez house, like a predator watching its prey. "Maria!" Grace called out, her voice tight with anxiety. "There's a weird truck outside." By the time Maria reached Grace's bedroom, 2 more vans had joined the first, and a small crowd of people with cameras and notepads had gathered on the sidewalk. Maria's face went pale as she recognized the unmistakable signs of media attention, the kind that turned private pain into public entertainment. "Get away from the window, Hart," Maria said softly, guiding Grace away from the glass. Carlos, you need to see this." The sound of hurried footsteps on the stairs was followed by Carlos's sharp intake of breath as he surveyed the scene below. "My God," he muttered, "how did they find out so quickly?" Grace pressed herself against Maria's side, her school clothes suddenly feeling inadequate protection against the chaos erupting outside her safe haven. "What do they want? Why are they here?" Before anyone could answer, the cacophony of ringing phones began, first the landline in the kitchen, then Carlos's cell phone, then Maria's. The electronic chorus created a nerve-wracking soundtrack to their mounting panic. "Don't answer any of them," Carlos instructed grimly. "Grace, you're not going to school today." "But I have a math test," Grace protested, clinging to the routine that had become her lifeline. "And Lily is expecting me to help her with her science project." "I'll call the school," Maria said, already moving toward the phone. "Mrs. Rodriguez will understand." As if summoned by some unseen signal, the doorbell rang. Once, twice, then continuously, as someone held their finger against the button. Through the living room window they could see a reporter with perfectly styled hair and a microphone, flanked by a cameraman whose lens was trained directly on their front door. "Martinez family," the reporter called out. "Channel 7 News would like to get your response to Marcus Sterling's custody petition. How do you feel about his claims that you're preventing a father from reuniting with his daughter?" Grace's blood ran cold. Marcus Sterling. That name meant nothing to her, yet somehow this stranger was turning her world upside down. "Who is Marcus Sterling?" she whispered. Carlos's expression darkened. "We'll find out, 100. But right now we need to focus on keeping you safe from this madness." The phone calls continued relentlessly. Maria finally answered one, hoping it might be Miss Chen with updates, but instead was greeted by an aggressive voice demanding a statement about the custody battle that's captivating the nation. "We have no comment," Maria said firmly before hanging up, but the phone rang again immediately. By mid-morning, the quiet residential street had transformed into a media carnival. News vans lined both sides of the street, their cables snaking across sidewalks and their satellite dishes creating a forest of technology. Reporters stood in clusters, comparing notes and rehearsing their segments. Photographers with enormous lenses lurked behind cars and trees, hoping to catch a glimpse of the family at the center of the story. Grace watched in horror from behind the living room curtains as Mrs. Patterson from next door was cornered by a reporter with a microphone, her elderly neighbor looking confused and overwhelmed by the aggressive questioning. "Mrs. Patterson, you've lived next to the Martinez family for 5 years. What can you tell us about their relationship with Grace? Do you think a biological father has the right to reclaim his child?" I don't understand," Mrs. Patterson stammered. "Grace is a lovely child. Maria and Carlos are wonderful parents. Why are you asking me these questions?" The reporter pressed closer, sensing vulnerability. "Sources tell us that Marcus Sterling, the best-selling author of Redemption Road, is Grace's biological father. Did you know the Martinez family was hiding a celebrity's daughter?" Grace's hands clenched into fists. "They're lying," she said fiercely. "We're not hiding anything." I'm not anyone's daughter except Maria and Carlos's. Carlos placed a protective hand on Grace's shoulder. Don't listen to them, Hundred. They don't know our family. They don't know our truth. But the damage was already being done. Through the window, they could see neighbors emerging from their houses, drawn by the commotion. Some looked concerned and protective, but others seemed curious about the sudden celebrity status of their quiet street. Grace recognized the look, the same mixture of fascination and suspicion she'd encountered in previous placements, when her complicated history became public knowledge. Maria's phone buzzed with a text message from her supervisor at the dental office where she worked as a hygienist. Reporters are calling here asking about you and Grace. I told them we don't discuss employees' personal lives, but you might want to take some time off until this blows over. I can't take time off, Maria said, her voice strained. We need the money for the legal fees we're about to face. Carlos wrapped his arms around both his wife and Grace. We'll figure it out, he promised. We've gotten through hard times before. Outside, a black limousine pulled up behind the news vans, its tinted windows and sleek lines standing out starkly against the middle-class neighborhood's modest homes. Grace watched as photographers swarmed toward the vehicle, their cameras clicking rapidly as a tall man in an expensive suit emerged. Even from a distance, even after 7 years of separation, Grace felt a cold recognition crawl up her spine. The man was older now, his dark hair styled and his face tanned. But something about his posture, his gestures, triggered fragments of memory she'd thought were buried forever. Is that him? She whispered. Is that Marcus Sterling? The man, her biological father, stood in front of cameras with practiced ease, his expression perfectly calibrated to convey both strength and vulnerability. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the street, trained by years of public appearances and media interviews. I know this situation is difficult for everyone involved, he said, his tone measured and sympathetic. But I'm simply a father who's overcome addiction and rebuilt his life, asking for the chance to know his daughter. I'm not here to hurt anyone. I'm here because I believe Grace deserves to know her biological father, and I deserve the chance to make amends for my past mistakes. Grace felt bile rise in her throat. The man's words sounded reasonable, even noble, but they felt like poison to her ears. Make amends? She said bitterly. Where was he when I was 3 years old and crying for someone to come get me? Where was he when I was 6 and asked my caseworker why my daddy didn't love me? Where was he when I was 8 and stopped believing that anyone would ever want to keep me? Maria pulled Grace closer, her own eyes blazing with protective fury. He has no right, she said quietly. No right to disrupt your life now, when you're happy and stable and loved. But even as she spoke the words, Maria felt a creeping dread that rights and love might not be enough to protect their family from the legal and media storm that was just beginning to unfold. The man outside their window had money, fame, and a compelling narrative of redemption. They had only their truth, their love, and their determination to keep the daughter of their hearts safe from the chaos threatening to destroy everything they'd built together. As the day wore on, the media presence only intensified, turning their quiet street into a battleground where their private family crisis would be fought in the harsh glare of public scrutiny. That night, as the media circus finally quieted to a dull murmur outside, Grace lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, her mind churning with fragments of memories she'd spent years trying to forget. The name Marcus Sterling had unlocked doors in her consciousness that she'd deliberately sealed shut, and now images and sensations flooded back with devastating clarity. She was 3 years old again, standing in a dingy apartment that smelled of cigarettes and something sharp and chemical that made her nose burn. A man's voice, raised in anger, cutting through the thin walls like broken glass, her mother's sobs echoing from the bathroom where she'd locked herself away, and always, always, the overwhelming smell of something wrong, not just the cigarettes and the chemicals, but the scent of abandonment itself, the particular odor of a man who was already halfway out the door. "Daddy?" her younger self had whispered, clutching Mr. Buttons to her chest as she peered around the corner into the living room. The man, Marcus Sterling, though she hadn't known his name then, movements. His hair was longer then, unkempt and greasy, and his clothes hung loose on a frame that spoke of missed meals and chemical dependencies. He'd looked up at her with eyes that were both familiar and strange. The same brown eyes she saw in her own reflection, but empty of recognition or love. "Yeah, kid," he'd said, not pausing in his packing. "Are you going away?" she'd asked, the question carrying all the weight of a child's desperate need for stability. "Your mom can handle things from here," he'd replied, not really answering, not really looking at her. "Be good for her, okay?" Those were the last words her biological father had spoken to her before walking out of their apartment and, as far as Grace knew, out of existence entirely. She'd stood in the doorway, watching his retreating figure, Mr. Buttons, clutched so tightly to her chest that his seams strained, understanding even at 3 years old that something irreplaceable was being lost. The memories cascaded through her consciousness like poison spreading through clear water. Her mother's descent into depression and substance abuse following Marcus's abandonment. The empty refrigerator and the nights when dinner was a sleeve of saltine crackers shared between them. The day the social workers came, their faces kind but implacable, as they explained that Mommy was sick and Grace needed to go somewhere safe while she got better. Grace remembered clutching Mr. Buttons as a caseworker, a woman with gentle hands and sad eyes, led her to a car that would take her to her first foster home. "When is Daddy coming back?" she'd asked through her tears. "When is he coming to get me?" The caseworker had knelt down to Grace's level, her expression carefully neutral. "Sweetheart, your daddy isn't listed on any of your paperwork. We don't have any way to contact him, but we're going to find you a family who will love you and take care of you, okay?" Even at 3, Grace had understood the subtext. There would be no rescue from a father who had already forgotten her existence. The foster homes that followed blurred together in Grace's memory, a kaleidoscope of temporary bedrooms, unfamiliar rules, and well-meaning adults who tried their best but could never quite bridge the gap between kindness and belonging. There was Mrs. Henderson, who made excellent pancakes, but ultimately decided Grace was too much work for her advancing age. There were the Johnsons, who seemed genuinely loving until their own biological child was born, and Grace became an afterthought. There was the group home where Grace learned to hoard food in her pillowcase and never cry where others could see her weakness. Through it all, Grace had maintained a stubborn kernel of hope that someday her father would return. Not the empty-eyed man who'd walked away from their apartment, but the father of her imagination, someone who would realize stories and scraped knees he'd missed. She remembered being 5 years old and asking her caseworker to help her write a letter to Daddy for Father's Day. The caseworker had gently explained that they still didn't have any contact information for Grace's father, but Grace had insisted on writing the letter anyway, her careful kindergarten handwriting spelling out, "I love you, Daddy. Please come find me." By age 6, Grace had begun scanning crowds for faces that might look like hers, wondering if every brown-eyed man might be the father who would recognize her and sweep her into the kind of fierce, protective love she saw in movies. She'd practiced what she would say when he found her. "I knew you'd come back for me. I knew you were just lost and couldn't find me." The court-ordered visitations that never materialized became a particularly cruel form of torture. Social workers would prepare Grace for meetings with her biological father, explaining that he'd expressed interest in seeing her, that maybe this time would be different. Grace would dress in her best clothes and sit in sterile visitation rooms, watching the clock and willing herself not to cry as minutes stretched into hours and no one came. "Maybe next time," the social workers would say, their voices heavy with the kind of practiced optimism that barely concealed their own frustration and sadness. But there was never a next time. Just an endless succession of missed appointments, broken promises, and the gradual erosion of Grace's faith that anyone would ever choose her above their own convenience. The breaking point had come when Grace was 8 years old and living with the Stevenson family, her 6th placement in 5 years. Mrs. Stevenson had found Grace crying in the bathroom after another failed visitation, her small shoulders shaking with the weight of accumulated disappointment. "Honey," Mrs. Stevenson had said gently, "maybe it's time to stop hoping for visits that aren't going to happen. Maybe it's time to focus on the people who are here, who want to be part of your life." Grace had looked up at her with eyes that were far too old for her 8-year-old face. "But what if he comes looking for me, and I'm not waiting anymore? What if he finally wants to be my daddy, and I've given up?" Mrs. Stevenson had knelt down and taken Grace's hands in hers. "Sweetheart, a real daddy doesn't make his little girl wait. A real daddy shows up. And if your biological father ever decides he wants to be part of your life, he'll find a way to do it that doesn't hurt you anymore." That night, Grace had made a conscious decision to stop waiting. She'd taken the Father's Day letter she'd written 3 years earlier, the one she'd kept folded in her pocket through 3 different placements, and torn it into tiny pieces. As she flushed the fragments down the toilet, empty bathroom. "I'm going to find a family who chooses me first, not last." It had taken 2 more years and 1 more failed placement before she'd found Carlos and Maria, but Grace had kept her promise to herself. She'd stopped asking about her biological parents, stopped scanning crowds for familiar faces, stopped hoping for rescue from someone who had already proven he was incapable of providing it. Now, 7 years after she'd buried those hopes, Marcus Sterling had returned, not as the loving father of her childhood fantasies, but as a stranger in an expensive suit who spoke about redemption and second chances while cameras rolled. The man who had never sent a birthday card was suddenly claiming parental rights. The father who had never answered a single one of her letters was demanding custody just days before her adoption was finalized. Grace rolled over in her bed, punching Mr. Buttons the way she had as a frightened 3-year-old. But she was 10 now, old enough to understand that some abandonments were permanent and some second chances came too late to matter. "You don't get to be my daddy now," she whispered into her pillow. "Maria and Carlos earned that. You just left." Outside her window, the media circus had quieted for the night, but Grace knew they would return tomorrow and the day after that, until this story played itself out in whatever way the adults and their lawyers decided. But regardless of what the courts ruled, regardless of what Marcus Sterling claimed he wanted, Grace had already made her choice. She belonged to the people who had chosen her. Every single day for 18 months, not to the man who had walked away when she was 3 and only returned when it became profitable to do so. Officer Sarah Thompson had learned to trust her partner's instincts long before she understood the science behind a German Shepherd's ability to read human character. 15 years of law enforcement, first as military police in Afghanistan, then as a civilian canine officer, had taught her that Rangers' behavioral alerts were more reliable than polygraph tests and more accurate than psychological profiles. So when her 4-year-old partner began displaying signs of extreme agitation during what should have been a routine patrol around the county courthouse, Thompson immediately went on high alert herself. It was Thursday morning, 2 days after Marcus Sterling's dramatic emergence into Grace Martinez's life, and the media circus surrounding the custody case showed no signs of abating. Thompson and Ranger had been assigned to maintain order around the courthouse perimeter. ensuring that the growing crowds of reporters, protesters, and curious onlookers didn't interfere with normal court operations. It was supposed to be a straightforward assignment, crowd control with a canine presence to deter any potential disruptions. But the moment Sterling stepped out of his black limousine for another carefully orchestrated press conference, Ranger's demeanor changed completely. The normally calm and controlled German Shepherd froze mid-step, his ears pricking forward with laser focus. Thompson felt the tension travel up through the leash as Ranger's muscles coiled, his hackles rising on a ridge of bristling fur along his spine. "Easy, boy," Thompson murmured. But her own instincts were already firing warning signals. In all their years together, she'd never seen Ranger react this intensely to someone who wasn't an immediate physical threat. Sterling was 50 yards away, surrounded by his legal team and publicists, but Ranger tracked his every movement with the intensity of a predator watching prey. When Sterling's voice carried across the courthouse steps, smooth, measured, perfectly calibrated for media consumption, Ranger emitted a low growl that rumbled from deep in his chest. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling was saying, his expensive suit and perfectly styled hair creating the image of a successful reformed man. "I want to be clear about my intentions. This isn't about disrupting anyone's life. This is about a father who's overcome addiction, rebuilt his career, and now wants the chance to know his daughter and provide for her future." Ranger's growl intensified, and Thompson felt the hair on her own arms stand up in response. She'd seen this kind of reaction from her partner exactly 3 times before. Once with a serial rapist who'd fooled everyone with his charming facade, once with a child predator who'd been masquerading as a youth pastor, and once with a domestic abuser whose neighbors all insisted he was such a nice, quiet man. In each case, Ranger had seen through carefully constructed masks to the predatory nature beneath. And in each case, subsequent investigations had proven the dog's instincts correct. "What is it, Ranger?" Thompson asked quietly, crouching down to place a calming hand on her partner's neck. The dog's muscles were rigid with tension, his brown eyes fixed unwaveringly on Sterling's figure. Thompson pulled a training treat from her pocket, Ranger's favorite beef jerky pieces that usually sent him into tail-wagging ecstasy. But when she offered it to him, he didn't even glance away from Sterling. The treat might as well have been cardboard for all the interest it generated. This was unprecedented. Ranger had never refused his favorite treats, not even during the most intense training exercises or high-stress operations. The fact that he was completely ignoring food while maintaining his aggressive posture toward Sterling sent chills down Thompson's spine. Thompson's background had shaped her into someone who recognized predators, both human and animal. Her own childhood in the foster care system had taught her to read the subtle signs of manipulation and abuse that others might miss. She'd learned to trust her gut instincts because they'd kept her alive through years of unstable placements and adults whose motivations weren't always pure. The military had refined those instincts, teaching her to assess threats quickly and accurately. 3 tours in Afghanistan had shown her that the most dangerous enemies were often the ones who appeared most trustworthy on the surface. She'd learned to pay attention to details others ignored, to trust her partner's senses even when logic suggested otherwise. Now, watching Sterling work the crowd with practiced charm, while Ranger vibrated with barely contained aggression, Thompson felt every alarm bell in her system ringing at maximum volume. "I understand the Martinez family's concerns," Sterling continued, his voice carrying just the right mix of empathy and determination. "But I also believe that Grace deserves to know her biological father, and I deserve the chance to make amends for my past mistakes. I'm not the same man who walked away 7 years ago. I'm sober, I'm successful, and I'm ready to be the father Grace deserves." Ranger's response was immediate and unmistakable, a sharp bark that cut through Sterling's speech like a knife. Several reporters turned toward the sound, and Thompson quickly moved to quiet her partner, but the damage was done. Sterling's eyes found hers across the courthouse steps, and for just a moment, his carefully constructed mask slipped. The look he gave her was calculating, assessing, tinged with the kind of cold intelligence that suggested he viewed people as obstacles to be managed rather than individuals to be respected. It was the look of someone who was already strategizing how to neutralize a potential threat to his plans. Thompson had seen that look before, in the eyes of men who hurt children and women who couldn't defend themselves. It was the look of a predator temporarily inconvenienced by the presence of law enforcement. "Come on, Ranger," she said quietly, leading her still agitated partner away from the crowd. But her mind was already working, processing what she'd witnessed and formulating a plan of action. She had no official jurisdiction in the custody case. Sterling hadn't committed any crimes in her presence, and his child custody petition was a civil matter outside her purview as a patrol officer. But Thompson's 15 years of experience had taught her that sometimes the most important police work happened in the gray areas, in the spaces between official procedures and moral obligations. As she and Ranger walked back toward their patrol car, Thompson made a decision that would define the next phase of her career. She was going to investigate Marcus Sterling, officially or otherwise. She was going to find out why her partner, who had never been wrong about character assessment, was treating this supposedly reformed man like a dangerous predator. And if her investigation revealed that Sterling posed a threat to Grace Martinez, Thompson was prepared to do whatever it took to protect that child, even if it meant bending some rules and risking her own career in the process. Stakes were too high, and Ranger's instincts were too reliable for her to do anything else. That evening, Thompson sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open, a cup of coffee growing cold beside her, and a legal pad covered with notes that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of Marcus Sterling's past. What had started as casual curiosity, driven by Ranger's unusual behavior, had evolved into a full-scale investigation that made her stomach turn with each new discovery. The law enforcement databases available to her as a sworn officer provided a treasure trove of information that Sterling's carefully crafted public image couldn't erase. His real name was Marcus Anthony Sterling, age 38, with a criminal history spanning multiple states and nearly 2 decades of increasingly serious offenses. The earliest arrest was from Phoenix, Arizona, when Sterling was 19. Possession of marijuana and underage drinking. Nothing too serious. The kind of youthful mistakes that many people made and moved beyond. But the pattern that emerged over the following years told a different story entirely. By age 21, Sterling had graduated to cocaine possession in Denver, Colorado. The arrest report noted that he'd been found unconscious in a hotel room with what appeared to be an overdose, though he'd ultimately been charged only with possession. The investigating officer's notes mentioned evidence of frequent drug use, and subject appeared to be living in squalid conditions, despite claims of employment in the music industry. Thompson cross-referenced the dates with public records and found the first of what would become a recurring theme. Sterling had fathered a child in Denver around the same time as his drug arrest, a daughter named Emma, born to a woman named Jennifer Martinez. No relation to Grace's Martinez family. Just a cruel coincidence of surnames. The child support records told their own story. Sterling had been court-ordered to pay $300 per month for Emma's care, but the payment history showed a sporadic pattern at best. 3 payments, made immediately after the court order, then nothing for 8 months, then 2 more payments, then nothing again. By the time Emma turned 2, Sterling had accumulated over $7,000 in unpaid child support and a warrant for his arrest. "Son of a bitch," Thompson muttered, making notes on her legal pad. "First kid abandoned at age 2, just like Grace." The next entry in Sterling's criminal history was from Atlanta, Georgia. 2 years later. Public intoxication. Disturbing the peace. Support, both financial and emotional, until the relationship collapsed entirely. Her phone calls to police departments in Phoenix, Denver, and Atlanta filled in the human details behind the cold legal records. Detective Maria Santos in Phoenix remembered the Jennifer Martinez case clearly. "That guy was a piece of work," Santos told Thompson over the phone. Jennifer was barely 20, working 2 jobs to support the baby, while Sterling claimed he was going to make it big as a musician. She believed he was just going through a rough patch, that he'd step up once his career took off. Classic manipulation tactics. "What happened to them?" Thompson asked. Jennifer eventually moved back in with her parents. Emma's probably 16 or 17 now. Last I heard, Sterling had never made contact after he left town. Just disappeared one day and never looked back. The Denver detective, James Morrison, had a similar story about Crystal Washington and her son Michael. Crystal was a waitress, sweet kid from a troubled background. Sterling convinced her he was some kind of artist, that she just needed to support him through the lean times, while he worked on his music. She worked double shifts to pay rent, while he spent her money on drugs, and claimed he was networking in the music scene. "Did he ever try to maintain contact with the child?" Thompson asked. Morrison's laugh was bitter. "Are you kidding? The guy couldn't even remember the kid's birthday. Crystal used to call us crying because Sterling would promise to show up for visitation and then never appear. Poor kid would sit by the window waiting for a daddy, who was probably getting high in some dive bar across town." As Thompson continued her research, the pattern became even more disturbing. She found records of at least 5 different women across 4 states, all young, all vulnerable, all ultimately abandoned, with children they couldn't afford to support. The women's ages when they'd gotten involved with Sterling ranged from 19 to 23. The children were all abandoned between the ages of 2 and 4, always around the time when the relationship became too demanding, or the financial responsibilities too burdensome. What made Thompson's blood run cold was the discovery that Sterling had briefly returned to several of these children's lives when they achieved some form of recognition or success. Emma Martinez had been featured in a local newspaper at age 12 for winning a regional spelling bee. Within a week, Sterling had contacted Jennifer, claiming he wanted to reconnect with his daughter and take her to Disney World. Jennifer had been suspicious enough to demand that Sterling submit to drug testing before any visitation could occur. Sterling had agreed, then disappeared again without explanation, when Sterling had suddenly emerged, full of paternal pride and promises of supporting Michael's athletic career. He'd attended 2 games, made a big show of cheering from the sidelines, then vanished again when Crystal mentioned that Michael needed expensive basketball shoes and equipment. Classic, narcissistic behavior, Thompson noted in her files, only shows interest when the children can provide him with positive attention or reflected glory. The most recent case was particularly chilling. A 15-year-old girl named Rebecca in Seattle had been featured in a local arts program showcase for her painting talent. Sterling had appeared at the event uninvited, claiming to be her biological father and trying to get photos with her for what he described as promotional purposes, for his upcoming book. The girl's mother had called police, and Sterling had been escorted from the premises, but not before several local media outlets had picked up the heartwarming reunion story. Thompson found the news articles online, complete with photos of Sterling posed with Rebecca, his arm around her shoulders, while she looked uncomfortable and confused. Thompson's phone rang, interrupting her research. The caller ID showed a Seattle area code. "Officer Thompson, this is Detective Linda Chen with Seattle PD. I understand you've been asking questions about Marcus Sterling." "That's right," Thompson confirmed. "I'm investigating his background in connection with a custody case here." "Good," Chen said grimly, "because I've been waiting for someone to take this guy seriously. The Rebecca Williams case I mentioned, that's not the end of it. Sterling has been using those photos and that news coverage to promote his book tour. He's literally profiting off of a child he abandoned as a toddler." Thompson felt her anger rising. "What about Rebecca? How is she handling this?" "Not well. The kid's been in therapy ever since. She'd never even heard Sterling's name before he showed up claiming to be her father. Her mother had told her that her biological father was someone who couldn't be part of their lives, trying to protect her from the truth about abandonment." As Thompson hung up the phone and stared at her growing file on Marcus Sterling, she realized she was looking at something far more sinister than a custody dispute. This was a pattern of predatory behavior targeting vulnerable women and children, a decades-long history of manipulation and abandonment that had left a trail of damaged lives across multiple states. And now, Sterling had set his sights on Grace Martinez, a child who had finally found stability and love, with a family that genuinely cared about her welfare. Thompson closed her laptop and reached down to scratch Ranger's ears. Her partner had been right to be agitated. Sterling wasn't just unsuitable to be Grace's father, he was actively dangerous to her emotional and psychological well-being. The question now was what Thompson could do about it, and how far she was willing to go to protect a child she'd never met from a predator who had perfected the art of legal manipulation. The next morning, Thompson made a decision that technically violated several departmental protocols, but aligned perfectly with her moral compass. She was going to meet the Martinez family, ostensibly as part of a community relations initiative, but really to assess the family dynamic and determine how best to protect Grace from Sterling's machinations. She'd spent the night reviewing everything she knew about Grace's case, and the parallels to her own childhood were too stark to ignore. Thompson had been 4 years old when she'd entered the foster care system, bounced between homes that ranged from genuinely caring to barely adequate, to quietly abusive. She'd learned to read adult motivations quickly, to distinguish between people who wanted to help children and people who wanted to use them. The Martinez house was located in a modest residential neighborhood, where children's bicycles lay scattered on front lawns, and the sound of lawnmowers created a suburban symphony. Thompson parked her patrol car at the curb, noting how dramatically different this street looked without the media circus that had invaded it earlier in the week. This was what normal looked like. Safe, stable, predictable. Ranger immediately began wagging his tail as they approached the front door, his body language completely different from his aggressive posture around Sterling. Where Sterling had triggered every warning instinct in the German Shepherd, this house seemed to radiate the kind of calm energy that put both animals and humans at ease. Maria Martinez answered the door with the cautious politeness of someone who'd been dealing with unwanted attention for days. She was a small woman with kind eyes and work-worn hands, wearing a simple blouse and jeans that suggested practical priorities over fashion concerns. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm Officer Thompson with the K-9 unit. I hope I'm not interrupting anything, but I wanted to stop by as part of our community relations program. With all the media attention your family has been receiving, I thought it might be helpful to check in and see if you need any assistance." Maria's expression shifted from wariness to relief. "Please, come in. Grace has been so frightened by all the reporters and cameras. It's been difficult." As Thompson and Ranger stepped into the living room, she immediately noticed details that her trained eye catalogued automatically. The house was clean, but lived in, with the kind of comfortable clutter that indicated an active family life. Children's artwork covered the refrigerator, homework assignments sat stacked on the kitchen table, and a pair of small sneakers by the front door suggested that Grace felt secure enough to kick off her shoes the moment she walked in. "Has a dog with her." The mention of a dog produced immediate results. Grace appeared in the doorway, her eyes widening as she spotted Ranger. Despite everything she'd been through in the past week, despite the fear and uncertainty that had dominated her life, her face lit up with the kind of pure joy that only children and dogs could inspire in each other. "Can I pet him?" Grace asked, looking between Thompson and Ranger with barely contained excitement. "Ranger would love that," Thompson replied, giving her partner the hand signal that indicated he was off duty and free to interact socially. He's very gentle with children. What happened next confirmed everything Thompson had suspected about both Ranger's instincts and Grace's character. The dog approached the 10-year-old with the careful gentleness he reserved for vulnerable individuals, lowering his head so she could reach him easily, and standing perfectly still while she wrapped her arms around his neck. Ranger's response to Grace was the complete opposite of his reaction to Sterling. Where Sterling had triggered aggression and suspicion, Grace inspired the German Shepherd's protective instincts. Thompson watched as her partner positioned himself between Grace and the front door, not out of concern for Grace's behavior, but as if he sensed her need for protection from external threats. "He likes you," Thompson observed, settling into the chair Maria offered her. "Ranger is usually pretty reserved with strangers, but he seems to have decided you're special." Grace's smile was radiant as she continued petting Ranger's head. "I've always wanted a dog," she said softly, "but in foster care you can't usually have pets." The simple statement hit Thompson like a physical blow. The matter-of-fact way Grace referenced her experience in foster care, the casual acceptance of deprivation that had shaped her expectations, reminded Thompson viscerally of her own childhood struggles. Carlos emerged from what appeared to be a home workshop, wiping his hands on a rag and wearing the kind of genuine smile that couldn't be manufactured. "Officer Thompson, Carlos Martinez, thank you for stopping by." Thompson shook his hand, noting the firm grip and calloused palms that spoke of honest work and practical skills. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I know this has been a difficult week for your family." "Difficult is an understatement," Carlos said, his expression darkening. "This man appears out of nowhere, claims he wants to be Grace's father, and suddenly our quiet life becomes a circus. Grace hasn't slept through the night since this started." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Grace looked up from where she was sitting on the floor with Ranger. "Can Officer Thompson stay for lunch?" she asked Maria. "And can Ranger stay too?" The invitation was extended with the kind of natural hospitality that Thompson had rarely encountered. Official business to be concluded as quickly as possible. But the Martinez family seemed genuinely interested in her as a person, not just as a representative of law enforcement. "If Officer Thompson has time, she's welcome to stay," Maria said, moving toward the kitchen. "I was just making grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup." Thompson found herself accepting the invitation, partly because it would give her more time to observe the family dynamic. but mostly because the warmth of their hospitality reminded her of everything she'd missed in her own childhood. As Maria prepared lunch, Thompson watched Carlos interact with Grace in ways that spoke volumes about their relationship. He didn't just help her with a jigsaw puzzle they'd apparently been working on together. He listened to her explanations of her strategy, asked her opinion about which pieces to try next, and celebrated her successes with genuine enthusiasm. "Grace is teaching me about patience," Carlos explained to Thompson with a grin. "I want to just try pieces randomly until something fits. But she has this whole system worked out. It's more efficient to sort by color and edge pieces first," Grace explained seriously, as if she were discussing advanced engineering principles. "Then you build the frame and work inward." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Thompson immediately noticed how Grace's entire body tensed, her eyes darting toward the front window with the hypervigilance of a child who'd learned that unexpected visitors often brought bad news. "It's okay, mija," Carlos said gently, placing a reassuring hand on Grace's shoulder. "I'll see who it is." Thompson followed Carlos to the front door, her own instincts on high alert. Through the window she could see a man in a suit holding official-looking documents, probably a process server or attorney representing Sterling's interests. "Mr. Martinez, I have legal documents regarding the custody petition for Grace Martinez. I need to serve these to you personally." Thompson watched Carlos accept the papers with the grim resignation of someone who knew his family was under legal attack. Grace had moved to stand behind Maria, her small frame pressed against her foster mother's back, as if seeking physical protection from whatever those documents contained. "What do they say?" Grace asked in a small voice. Carlos scanned the papers, his expression growing darker with each page. "It's a motion for immediate, temporary custody," he said finally. "Sterling's lawyers are asking the court to place you with him while the full custody hearing is pending." The sound Grace made was somewhere between a whimper and a sob. Thompson felt her own protective instincts surge as she watched this brave, intelligent child crumble under the weight of adult, legal machinations she couldn't understand or control. "That's not technically granted her. There are procedures, investigations, safeguards. No judge is going to remove a child from a stable home and place her with someone she doesn't know without extensive review." Even as she spoke the words, Thompson was making mental calculations about how to use her investigation into Sterling's background to support the Martinez family's case. She had evidence of Sterling's pattern of abandoning children, his history of drug use, his manipulation of vulnerable families. It might not be admissible in a custody hearing, but it could certainly be shared with the right people in the right way. As Thompson prepared to leave, Grace approached her with a kind of solemn dignity that broke Thompson's heart. "Officer Thompson," Grace said quietly, "will you help us? I don't want to go with that man. I want to stay with Maria and Carlos. They're my real family." Thompson knelt down to Grace's level, looking into brown eyes that held far too much wisdom and pain for a 10-year-old child. "I'm going to do everything I can to help," she promised. "Sometimes grown-ups make things complicated, but there are people whose job it is to make sure children are safe and happy. I'm one of those people." As she walked back to her patrol car with Ranger, Thompson was already formulating a plan that would push the boundaries of her official authority, but align perfectly with her moral obligations. She was going to protect Grace Martinez from Marcus Sterling, even if it meant risking her own career in the process. The stakes were too high, and the parallels to her own childhood too painful for her to do anything else. The green room at Channel 7's morning show hummed with pre-broadcast chaos. but Marcus Sterling sat in the makeup chair, radiating the composure of a man who had turned media manipulation into an art. His publicist, Amanda Cross, a crisis management veteran, paced behind him, drilling talking points. "Redemption, not justification," she said. "Pause 3 seconds when you mention the 7 years of absence. Let your voice catch. Then say you stayed away to protect Grace from your addiction." Sterling nodded, already thinking of the 300% sales spike in his memoir, Redemption Road, since filing for custody of his 10-year-old daughter. The custody fight had made his niche recovery memoir a media sensation, pushing it to number 12 on Amazon. Foreign publishers were bidding, film producers were calling, and speaking engagements were pouring in at $25,000 each. Amanda prepped him for the emotional beats. "One drop in each eye before you talk about missing Grace's childhood. Let the audience believe this is raw and real." Sterling had perfected it. The tremor in his voice, the glisten without smudging makeup, the righteous frustration at a legal system keeping reformed parents from their children. He had been too broken to be a father, but now he was the man Grace deserves. When pressed about the Martinez family, who had cared for Grace for 18 months, he expressed gratitude but insisted he could offer opportunities they can't: private school, travel, a trust fund. Behind the scenes, Amanda and the legal team clipped the most sympathetic soundbites for social media. Hashtags like "second chances" trended within hours, amplified by bot accounts. Supportive comments flooded in, though some turned ugly toward the Martinez family, basically kidnappers and selfish foster parents. Sterling's phone buzzed non-stop with interview requests and sales reports. Over lunch, Amanda outlined the next moves: more talk shows and a chance encounter with reporters outside Grace's school to cement his image as the denied but devoted father. The fact that Sterling had never once written, called, or met Grace directly was irrelevant to the campaign. She was the prop in his redemption story. At Hartwell, Morrison & Associates, lead attorney Victoria Hartwell laid out custody battle plans like a general mapping a war. The pitch was simple. Sterling could provide a life the Martinez family could never match. Not love versus money, love plus money. The numbers told a striking story. In 6 months, Sterling's royalties had hit $340,000, with $180,000 more from foreign and audio rights. Speaking contracts worth $500,000 were booked for the next year, and movie rights negotiations hinted at $2.3 million. He would create a $1.5 million education trust for Grace, covering private schooling, tutoring, and higher education. By contrast, Carlos and Maria Martinez's combined annual income was $67,000. They owned a modest home, drove used cars, and had $4,300 in savings. Investigators found no damaging dirt, just late mortgage once during a medical emergency and 2 unpaid parking tickets. Neighbors and employers described them as devoted and stable. "They're too clean," the investigator admitted. Hartwell reframed it: well-meaning but limited. The legal narrative would focus on maximizing potential: exclusive schools with $28,000 tuition, elite summer camps, international travel, and cultural exposure. Education consultants would testify about benefits of private schooling. Financial planners would highlight the trust fund. Child development experts would stress the need for enrichment for gifted children like Grace. The message: the Martinez family offered love, but Sterling could offer love and limitless opportunity. One investigator raised a caution. Sterling's fortune was recent and volatile, dependent on spotted a man with a telephoto lens crouching in a neighbor's yard. Within minutes, 3 more photographers appeared, one with a lighting kit. Maria hustled Grace out the back door toward Carlos's car, but the paparazzi swarmed, shouting questions. "How do you feel about your biological father wanting to be part of your life? Are you excited?" Grace clung to Maria, ducking her head. Cameras pressed against the car windows, capturing her frightened face. Carlos shouted, "She's a child! Have some decency!" But it only fueled their frenzy. The short drive to school turned into a chase, 2 cars tailing them, with photographers leaning out the windows. At Lincoln Elementary, the principal and security guards formed a protective corridor. But inside the cafeteria, a classmate showed Grace her photo online. Tears streaked, terrified, under the headline, "Custody Battle. 10-year-old Grace Martinez caught in tug-of-war." The comments were worse than the headline. Critiqued her clothes, speculated about her loyalty, and accused her foster parents of poisoning her against Sterling. Grace fled to the bathroom and vomited. "Why do they want pictures of me when I'm crying?" she asked her friend Lily. Lily could only say, "It's not fair." The school locked down access, but the damage was done. In an emergency meeting, the Martinez family's lawyer explained that restraining orders could keep photographers at a distance, but not off public property or off the internet. "How is it legal to terrorize a child for entertainment?" Carlos demanded. That night, Grace asked Maria the same haunting question. Maria told her, "Some people see pain as entertainment. They forget you're a real person." Grace whispered, "But I am a real person. And this really hurts," as she fell asleep clutching her stuffed animal. Maria sat beside her, grieving the innocence stolen by strangers with cameras. The custody fight was just beginning, but Grace had already learned that in a public battle, every tear becomes content, and no one asks the child what she actually wants. On the 18th floor of the Meridian building, 2 very different war rooms prepared for the same custody battle over Grace Martinez. In the southeast corner, Victoria Hartwell's sleek conference room at Hartwell, Morrison and Associates commanded a view of the financial district. Around the mahogany table sat 8 attorneys, 3 paralegals, 2 private investigators, and a high-profile media consultant. The walls were lined with photos, financial records, and charts mapping Marcus Sterling's transformation. Rehab certificates, faith milestones, book signings, and bank statements. Hartwell's plan was to dependability. Financial experts would testify about a $1.5 million education trust, elite private schools, and opportunities most families can only dream of. She acknowledged her advantage over David Kim, the Martinez family's lawyer. He's arguing love and stability against unlimited opportunity. It's a losing proposition. Across town, Kim's cramped office ran on donated law student labor and a folding card table. His witness list had no celebrities, just Grace's teachers, therapists, neighbors, and family members. They would testify about her healing, happiness, and strong bonds with Carlos and Maria Martinez. Carlos's brother, a pediatrician, and Maria's sister would add family perspectives. Kim knew resources were lopsided, but stressed their message. Sterling's never been a father. Grace's needs are already being met by people who love her unconditionally. Court-appointed guardian, Dr. Patricia Gomez, worked in a neutral courthouse office, stacked with interview transcripts and evaluations. On paper, Sterling's sobriety and finances looked solid. In person, he gave perfectly polished but generic answers about Grace, knowing none of her small but telling details. The Martinez family, by contrast, knew her weekend pancake ritual, her fear of thunderstorms, her art talent and handwriting struggles. Grace herself told Gomez, "Real love means showing up every day, not just when it's convenient." Asked to draw both lives, Grace's Martinez family sketches were vivid and warm, her Sterling drawings vague and empty. Gomez's report noted Grace's clear preference, but also the legal weight of biological reunification. At the private Meridian Club, Sterling was drilled by Hartwell and media coach Dr. Eleanor Hayes on projecting managed authenticity. They rehearsed answers to the hardest questions: why he waited 7 years, why he filed just before the adoption. His responses blended remorse with resolve. He'd stayed away until he was the father Grace deserved. But behind the scenes, Sterling manipulated testimony. His unemployed brother Eddie, dependent on monthly support payments, was coached to back Sterling's recovery story, despite never seeing him at AA. Sterling supplied names, dates, and fictional sponsors to make lies sound true. His sobriety was a facade, maintained through rapid detox clinics, masking agents, clean urine bought from desperate addicts, and non-existent AA relationships. Amanda Cross arranged suppliers and schedules to ensure he could pass any test. The story of his spiritual transformation was a crafted performance, rehearsed tears, curated anecdotes, and a narrative designed to sell both his custody bid and his brand. In her softly lit office, Gomez years in foster care, where security depended on pleasing adults. At home, Maria and Carlos explained she should tell the truth about how you feel, and that their love didn't depend on her answers. Still, the pressure brought sleepless nights, stomach aches, and moments of muteness. Grace feared freezing up during testimony. They practiced with Gomez, asking for water, repeating questions, taking breaks. Yet her deeper confusion remained. How could Sterling claim love without ever sending a card or helping with homework? Why did adults think money mattered more than daily acts of care? With Mr. Buttons, the stuffed rabbit, she voiced the questions she couldn't ask others. What if being honest hurts someone I love? What if it means I have to leave my real family? She worried the judge might see wanting to stay as selfish or ungrateful. Gomez stressed the judge's role was to decide what's best for her, not to make adults happy. Grace practiced her answers like homework, but there was no study guide for choosing between the love she knew and the opportunities she was promised. The night before court, she lay in bed, clutching Mr. Buttons, whispering Maria's taught prayer. Please help me say the right things. Please let me stay home. In the morning, she would face a courtroom of adults claiming to protect her, and try to explain why the safety and love she'd found with the Martinez family meant more than all Marcus Sterling's money could buy. The October rain made perfect cover for surveillance, the gray sky blending Thompson's unmarked car into the cityscape as she trailed Sterling's black BMW. For 3 days, she'd monitored his AA meeting hours, only to uncover a web of lies. Sterling's routine began at St. Matthew's Community Center, where NA met daily. At 2 p.m. sharp, he'd enter with the humble air of a man in recovery, only to slip out a side door 20 minutes later. Thompson tailed him to a run-down East Side apartment complex, the sort of place where visitors went unremarked. Inside apartment 3B lived Derek Martinez, a convicted drug dealer. Ranger, Thompson's German Shepherd partner, bristled as they approached, his hackles up. Following Sterling's scent up 3 flights, they stopped outside 3B. Through the thin walls, she heard Sterling's real voice, cold, transactional, negotiating for cocaine and untraceable supplies. Then Sterling pulled out a burner phone. Thompson, angling for a clear shot through the window, photographed message threads detailing paid false witnesses, clean urine samples, bribed court officials, and his ultimate goal, winning custody of Grace Martinez to fuel a $3.2 million investigations into Sterling's finances, aiming for tax evasion, wire fraud, and conspiracy charges. Time was short. Grace's custody hearing was in a week. Thompson drove home in the rain, conflicted between her duty to follow the law and her moral need to protect Grace. Soon Riley texted, "Federal warrants filed, emergency hearing Thursday." A glimmer of hope, but Thompson dug deeper, interviewing Sterling's other children, each telling the same story of charm, promises, media stunts tied to their achievements, followed by abandonment. Emma, 17, recalled waiting as a child for a father who never came, until she won a spelling bee. Sterling reappeared with flowers, a photographer, and claims her success proved his redemption. Weeks later, he vanished again. Michael, 15, in Denver, had a similar experience. Sterling's sudden presence during his basketball rise, public cheering, and promises of Lakers games. When Michael was injured, Sterling disappeared without a word. Rebecca, 16, in Seattle, had never met him until her art show, when he arrived with a hired photographer and reporter, posing for authentic reunion shots, later used in promotions. She described feeling like a prop in someone else's story. Court orders for child support had gone unpaid. Emma's mother was owed $85,000, Michael's $67,000, Rebecca's nothing. Yet Sterling spent thousands staging these photo ops. By now, Thompson's file painted Sterling as a serial manipulator who weaponized children's achievements for publicity, abandoned them when they ceased to be useful, and never provided real support. Grace was next in line. Her captain, John Morrison, confronted her about harassing a public figure and unauthorized overtime. Thompson stood firm. Protecting children from predators is exactly what we're supposed to do. With less than 72 hours to the hearing, she coordinated across 4 states. Riley struggled to secure warrants in time. Seattle judges wanted more proof of Sterling's activities there. That proof came from Detective Linda Chen, who uncovered receipts showing Sterling had paid for Rebecca's entire reunion event, including venue, press, and photographer, a full fabrication. The procedural hurdles were immense. Chain of custody for evidence from multiple jurisdictions could take weeks to finalize. But then Ranger found the break they needed. During surveillance at Sterling's hotel, he tracked him to a meeting with Derek Martinez and to a dumpster where Sterling had dumped the burner phone. On it were texts proving federal crimes. Wire anyone for a long time. Driving home before dawn, exhaustion and relief washed over her. Ranger, sensing her mood, placed a paw on her arm. Together, they had followed the trail, from courthouse steps to drug dens, from abandoned children to federal crimes, unraveling a predator's web to protect one more child from becoming a prop in his performance. Judge Margaret Walsh's courtroom radiated austere dignity. For 23 years, she had decided the futures of children, and her elevated bench, framed by dark mahogany and harsh fluorescent light, commanded respect. At 58, her silver hair was pulled into a severe bun, her gaze sharp behind the black robes that seemed to absorb light. "We are here to determine the best interests of Grace Elizabeth Martinez, age 10, she began, her voice deliberate, knowing every word might be appealing. The gallery was packed with reporters and sketch artists. Cameras waited outside. Grace, small in her navy dress, sat between Carlos and Maria Martinez. She clutched a worn, stuffed rabbit, Mr. Buttons, her hands trembling, eyes darting between the judge, lawyers, and strangers staring at her life like entertainment. Her guardian ad litem, Dr. Patricia Gomez, sat close, protective. Victoria Hartwell, Sterling's attorney, delivered a polished plea. Marcus Sterling was a man redeemed, 18 months sober, a best-selling author ready to give Grace the love, stability, and opportunities her guardians could not. Defense attorney David Kim countered with quiet conviction. Grace had already found safety, love, and stability with the Martinezes. This wasn't about money or redemption arcs. It was about preserving the secure, healing life she had built. Sterling, in a tailored suit and silver tie, took the stand. His story was carefully choreographed. Addiction, estrangement, noble absence to spare Grace pain, followed by a spiritual awakening and transformation. He claimed 18 months sobriety, book and speaking successes, and a $1.5 million trust fund for Grace's education. The emotional peak came when he spoke directly to Grace. "I've missed 7 years of her life. I can't get them back, but I can make sure she doesn't miss any more opportunities." Kim exposed cracks. Sterling achieved sobriety in March, but didn't file for custody until October. He'd had no direct contact with Grace, not even a birthday card. Sterling insisted legal advice had delayed contact. Kim let the absence hang in the air. Sterling then pivoted. Mentorship. Father Michael Rodriguez, Sterling's priest, vouched for his faith and service. Their message: Sterling was transformed, successful, and a role model. Third-grade teacher Elena Rodriguez described the Grace she met 18 months ago, withdrawn, hoarding food, flinching from adults, and the child she'd become, confident, engaged, smiling. Removing her from this stability would be devastating. Neighbor Mrs. Patterson told of watching Carlos teach Grace to ride a bike. Maria braiding her hair, homework help after long work days, unpaid, unseen acts of love. Dr. Miguel Martinez, a pediatrician and Carlos's brother, outlined Grace's medical and psychological healing. She'd gone from classic trauma symptoms to secure attachments and normal development. Removing her could trigger lifelong relational damage. Sterling's side offered potential: money, connections, celebrity endorsements. The Martinez side offered reality: daily love, proven healing, community roots. Judge Walsh weighed two visions, one of glittering opportunities, the other of emotional security. The next day, Grace would speak for herself. The red digits on Grace's bedside clock glowed at 3:47 a.m. She lay stiff under the sheets Maria had tucked in with care, her body aching with anxiety. In a few hours, she would stand in court and tell a judge why she didn't want to live with Marcus Sterling, the man who was her biological father, but little else. What if she said the wrong thing? What if Judge Walsh got angry? What if her words weren't enough to keep her safe with Carlos and Maria? Turning toward the window, she tried Dr. Gomez's breathing exercises. In for 4, hold, out for 4. Crowded the steps, but Dr. Gomez's calm smile anchored her. When her name was called, the courtroom fell silent. Grace walked to the stand, small in the vast room, but holding herself with quiet dignity. The deputy knelt to explain the oath. "I do," she said softly. Dr. Gomez began gently, asking her name and age. "Grace Elizabeth Martinez. I'm 10 years old." She spoke haltingly about foster homes, keeping clothes in a suitcase, hoarding food, listening for dangerous footsteps, crying silently at night. Then, when asked about the Martinez family, her voice brightened. She told of Carlos teaching her pancakes on Saturdays, Maria braiding her hair every morning, bedtime stories, because that's what families do. "Home is when people choose you every single day," Grace explained. "Maria and Carlos chose me when I was broken, and they helped me learn how to not be broken anymore." She described safety in small certainties, being picked up from school at 3:15, lunch packed with a note, family dinners, learning Spanish from Carlos's mother. The real family is people who love you not because they have to, but because they choose to. When asked her hopes, she said simply, "I just want to stay home. I want to keep being Grace Martinez. I want to keep being their daughter." Then came cross-examination. Attorney Victoria Hartwell spoke gently. "Don't you think it might be nice to get to know your real father?" The phrase triggered a shutdown. Grace froze, silent, her eyes distant. Dr. Gomez recognized the trauma response and approached. But Grace's gaze found Carlos and Maria in the gallery. "He's not my real father," she said, voice steadying. "Carlos is my real father. He taught me to ride a bike, helped me with homework, and came to my school plays. He makes pancakes, shaped like stars, and tells me I'm brave when I'm scared. Marcus Sterling never came when I was scared. Maria and Carlos always come when I'm scared." She went on, "I don't care if Marcus Sterling has more money. I don't want opportunities. I want a family. Real fathers don't wait 7 years to meet their daughters. Real fathers don't need judges to tell them to take care of their children. Real fathers show up." The courtroom stirred, reporters scribbling, muffled sobs from the gallery. Even Judge Walsh's composure wavered. Hartwell's strategy had backfired. Instead of weakening Grace's testimony, she had drawn out its heart. That love is proven by showing up every day. Judge Walsh called a recess, but the turning point had come. Grace had left Mr. Buttons at home to protect herself, and she had done just that, speaking not just for herself, but for every child whose voice had been ignored. The recess stretched nearly 40 minutes as Judge Walsh handled motions and the aftershock of Grace's testimony. The calm sleep. At her side, Ranger moved with taut focus.
Your Honor,
Thompson said, voice tight.
I have evidence this court needs to hear, immediately.
Victoria Hartwell shot up. Highly irregular. She has no standing here. But David Kim leaned forward.
If this concerns Grace's welfare, it must be heard.
Walsh hesitated, then nodded. Thompson set audio equipment on the clerk's desk.
Recordings from a federal investigation. Mr. Sterling discussing drug use, coaching witnesses to perjure themselves, and planning to exploit Grace for profit.
The first tape caught Sterling coaching his brother Eddie to lie about attending AA meetings. Eddie's reluctance was met with manipulation.
You're not lying. You're confirming the broader truth of my transformation.
The second.
Sterling ordering cocaine days before the hearing. After I get custody of Grace, I can be more flexible. Right now, everything has to look perfect.
The third.
The movie deal's confirmed if I win custody. Estimated $3.2 million. Grace's custody is essential for brand continuation.
Hartwell demanded suppression for illegal surveillance. Kim countered with child welfare. Walsh ruled the evidence admissible. Sterling returned to the stand, his polish gone. Kim confronted him.
Were you telling the truth about 18 months sober?
Yes.
Sterling said weakly. Kim played the cocaine recording. Sterling's face drained.
Taken out of context. Explain how buying drugs fits your testimony.
Kim pressed. Sterling dodged.
Recovery is a process.
But the courtroom heard only evasion. The profit motive tape hit harder. Kim.
Which is true? Love for Grace or financial gain?
Sterling snapped.
Grace is part of my story, my brand. I have every right to benefit.
Finally, Kim played Sterling instructing Eddie to lie under oath. The image of a reformed father collapsed entirely. Outside, media coverage pivoted from redemption to disgrace. Sterling's publicist quit on the spot. Prosecutors prepared arrest warrants for fraud, witness tampering, conspiracy. In the gallery, Grace sat between Carlos and Maria, watching without glee, only relief that the truth was visible at last. Federal marshals led Sterling away. For Grace, the path to staying with her chosen family was finally clear. By afternoon, the courthouse steps transformed from protest to celebration. Neighbors, classmates, teachers, strangers, all holding signs. Let Grace choose. Every child deserves real love. Grace's third-grade teacher told reporters, "We're fighting for the right of every child to grow up surrounded by unconditional love." Children held a bright banner. "Grace is our friend," ringed with glitter hearts. Lily Chen, Grace's best friend, showed a drawing Grace made, her between Carlos and Maria under a rainbow. The Martinez relatives arrived in force. Abuela Rosa declared,
"Grace is our granddaughter. We chose her, and she chose us. No judge can change that."
Then came 3 teens, Sterling's, other abandoned children. Emma Martinez, 17. He doesn't want to be Grace's father. He wants to own the story. There's a difference. Michael Washington spoke of false love when cameras are rolling. Rebecca Williams held a sign, "Children are not content." Advocates and social workers mingled with neighbors. Dr. Amanda Foster, Grace's therapist, "This is what healthy attachment looks like. Commitment through daily action." Grace stepped out briefly, flanked by Carlos and Maria. She spoke into a mic. "Thank you for helping me stay home." As the sun set, the steps were covered in flowers, drawings, and letters. The coverage shifted from Sterling's collapse to the unity of a community that had chosen to protect one child's right to remain where love was proven daily. Judge Margaret Walsh returned to the bench after a 2-hour recess, her gray eyes carrying the weight of one of the most difficult custody decisions of her career. The packed gallery fell silent. This ruling would determine not only Grace's future, but how courts might handle cases where biology clashed with proven care. On one side stood Marcus Sterling, wealth, fame, and the theoretical opportunities that came with them. On the other, 18 months of love, stability, and healing with the Martinez family that had transformed a traumatized foster child into a confident young girl. But it was the audio recordings that changed everything. Sterling's own voice, exposing him as a manipulative predator who saw Grace not as a daughter, but as a business asset. His public declarations of paternal devotion crumbled against private admissions of financial motives. "The evidence reveals Mr. Sterling's transformation is fictitious," Judge Walsh said firmly. "He has engaged in fraud, perjury, and child exploitation. This court will not reward such conduct with custody of a vulnerable child." Turning to the Martinez family, her tone softened. Grace has thrived in your care, academically, emotionally, and socially. She has found stability, love, and safety. A ruling left no room for appeal. The court hereby terminates all parental rights of Marcus Anthony Sterling. Adoption by Carlos and Maria Martinez is to be completed within 30 days. A permanent restraining order is issued, barring any contact. Grace's sob of joy filled the room as she clung to Carlos and Maria. Applause erupted, teachers wiping away tears, classmates cheering, the Martinez family embracing in relief. In the back, Sterling's other abandoned children wept, seeing at last a system to protect rather than fail. Judge Walsh's final words would be quoted for years. Our obligation is to the welfare of children, not to the convenience of adults who claim parental rights without fulfilling parental responsibilities. Was home. Forever. The gavel's final strike echoed through the courtroom like a bell announcing not just the end of legal proceedings, but the beginning of Grace's life as a truly free child, who belonged exactly where she had always wanted to be. Home. The media firestorm that followed Judge Walsh's ruling created a stark before and after narrative of Marcus Sterling's spectacular rise and even more dramatic fall from public grace. Within hours of the custody decision, the carefully constructed image that had made Sterling a best-selling author and sought-after speaker crumbled under the weight of his own recorded admissions and the federal criminal charges that were filed against him before he could even leave the courthouse. Sterling's book, Redemption Road: My Journey from Rock Bottom, plummeted from its position near the top of bestseller lists as retailers struggled to keep up with return requests and online reviewers savaged what they now understood to be a work of fiction marketed as memoir. Amazon showed over 3,000 one-star reviews posted in the first 24 hours after the court ruling, with readers expressing their outrage at being deceived by someone they had trusted with their own recovery stories and financial support. I bought this book for my brother who's struggling with addiction, wrote one typical reviewer. Now I find out the author is a fraud who was using drugs while promoting sobriety and exploiting his own daughter for profit. This isn't just false advertising. It's dangerous to people who need real hope and real recovery resources. Meridian Press, Sterling's publisher, moved quickly to distance themselves from the scandal. Jonathan Blackwood, who had testified so confidently about Sterling's reliability and character, issued a statement announcing the immediate suspension of Sterling's book contract and the cancellation of all planned promotional activities. We were deceived by Mr. Sterling's misrepresentations about his sobriety and character, the statement read. Meridian Press is committed to publishing authentic stories of recovery and redemption, not fraudulent narratives designed to exploit vulnerable readers. The movie deal that Sterling had discussed so callously in his recorded conversations was canceled within hours of the court proceedings, with the production company citing material misrepresentations about the source material in their termination notice. Speaking engagement bureaus that had booked Sterling for corporate events and university lectures scrambled to cancel upcoming appearances and issue refunds to clients who no longer wanted to be associated with his discredited message. But Sterling's attempts to salvage his career and reputation revealed the same narcissistic manipulation that had characterized his approach to parenthood. Rather than accepting responsibility for his deceptions, he embarked on a desperate campaign to reframe himself as the victim of a vindictive legal system, and an ex-foster family that had poisoned Grace against her biological father. His appearances on fringe media outlets and conspiracy theory podcasts painted a picture of a man completely disconnected from reality. The system is rigged against fathers who are trying to reconnect with their children, Sterling claimed during one particularly delusional interview. "I was set up by corrupt police officers and a legal system that profits from keeping families separated." These desperate attempts at reputation rehabilitation only serve to further damage Sterling's credibility and highlight the contrast between his public victimhood narrative and the audio evidence of his private admissions about exploiting Grace for financial gain. Legal experts who analyzed his media appearances noted that his continued public statements were likely to complicate his defense against the federal charges of wire fraud, witness tampering, and conspiracy that had been filed against him. Meanwhile, Officer Sarah Thompson found herself thrust into an unexpected spotlight as news outlets sought to understand how a patrol officer had managed to expose such an elaborate fraud. Her investigation, which had begun with Rangers' instinctive distrust of Sterling's character, was being hailed as a model of dedicated police work that prioritized child welfare over procedural convenience. Thompson's captain, John Morrison, who had initially warned her about getting too involved in the custody case, now found himself fielding calls from police departments across the country who wanted to understand Thompson's investigative methods. "Officer Thompson exemplifies the best qualities of law enforcement," Morrison told reporters. "She saw a child in danger and refused to let bureaucratic limitations prevent her from protecting that child." The federal prosecutors who had worked with Thompson to build the criminal case against Sterling praised her coordination and evidence-gathering skills. Marcus Riley, her former military partner who had helped navigate the complex legal requirements for admitting her surveillance evidence, recommended Thompson for promotion to detective with a specialization in crimes against children. Sarah Thompson risked her career to protect a vulnerable child from a predatory adult, Riley told the police commission that reviewed her promotion application. "That's exactly the kind of judgment and moral courage we need in leadership positions throughout law enforcement." Grace's story had implications that extended far beyond her individual case, inspiring legislative proposals in several states to strengthen protections for children against exploitative biological parents who sought custody primarily for financial or publicity reasons. Child welfare advocates used Grace's testimony and the evidence of Sterling's manipulation to argue for reforms that would prioritize children's expressed preferences and demonstrated stability over theoretical. Dr. Patricia Gomez, Grace's guardian ad litem, found herself speaking at conferences about the importance of listening to children's voices in custody proceedings. Grace Martinez was able to articulate what she needed to feel safe and loved, Gomez told audiences of family law attorneys and child welfare professionals. "Too often, we make decisions about children's futures without truly hearing what the children themselves are telling us about their experiences and preferences." The Martinez family, meanwhile, made a conscious decision to avoid the continued media attention that followed Sterling's downfall. Despite requests for interviews from major news networks and offers for book deals about their experience, Carlos and Maria chose to focus on Grace's healing and their transition to being a legally recognized family. "We never wanted to be famous," Maria told the one reporter she agreed to speak with, a local journalist who had covered Grace's story with sensitivity and respect. "We just wanted to love Grace and help her heal from everything she went through before she came to us. Now that the legal battle is over, we want to get back to being a normal family." Their decision to prioritize privacy over publicity provided yet another contrast with Sterling's behavior. Where he had sought media attention to promote his own interests, the Martinez family sought to protect Grace from further exposure and allow her to process her experiences away from public scrutiny. The lasting impact of Grace's case would be measured not in television appearances or book sales, but in the legislative changes it inspired, the precedents it set for family courts, and most importantly, in the life of one 10-year-old girl who had finally found the security and love she had been seeking throughout her journey through the foster care system. As the media attention gradually shifted to other stories and Sterling's criminal trial, Grace Martinez was finally free to be exactly what she had always wanted to be, a normal child in a loving family, protected from exploitation, and surrounded by people who valued her for who she was, rather than what she represented. 6 months after Judge Walsh's ruling, the same courtroom that had witnessed Grace's most terrifying and triumphant moments hosted a celebration that was intimate, joyful, and blissfully free from media attention. Grace's official adoption ceremony took place on a sunny Tuesday morning in March, with only the people who truly mattered in attendance: family members who had already claimed Grace as their own, teachers who had witnessed her transformation, and a handful of close friends who understood the profound significance of this legal formality that would make permanent what had been true in their hearts for nearly 2 years. Judge Walsh, wearing the same black robes, but with a smile that transformed her entire demeanor, watched as Grace approached the bench, flanked by
the terrified child who had clutched Mr. Buttons and struggled to find her voice. In this same room, in her place, stood a confident 11-year-old, who carried herself with the security that came from knowing exactly where she belonged and who she was. "Grace Elizabeth Martinez," Judge Walsh said, using the name that would now be legal and permanent. "Do you understand that this adoption means Carlos and Maria Martinez will be your parents forever, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails?" Grace's response was delivered with the clear, strong voice of someone who had found her place in the world. "Yes, Your Honor. They've already been my real parents for a long time. This just makes it official." The legal ceremony was brief but meaningful, with Carlos and Maria signing papers that formalized what their hearts had claimed the moment Grace had first smiled at their kitchen table over chocolate chip pancakes. Dr. Gomez was there as a witness, along with Mrs. Rodriguez from Lincoln Elementary and Abuela Rosa, whose Spanish prayers of gratitude filled the courtroom with warmth and joy. As Judge Walsh signed the final adoption decree, she looked directly at Grace with an expression that conveyed both professional satisfaction and personal happiness. "Congratulations, Grace Martinez. You're officially home." The celebration that followed was held at the Martinez house, which had been decorated with streamers and balloons by Grace's cousins and neighbors, who understood that this was the kind of milestone that deserved recognition. But the most meaningful decorations were the ones Grace had created herself: artwork that covered the refrigerator, family photos that filled every available surface, and the bedroom that had been transformed from a temporary foster placement space into the permanent sanctuary of a beloved daughter. Grace's bedroom bore little resemblance to the sparse, careful space she had first occupied 18 months earlier. The walls were covered with her own artwork, ribbons from school competitions, and photographs that documented her integration into the Martinez family. Her bookshelf, still built by Carlos but now painted a soft lavender at Grace's request, overflowed with books they had chosen together at the library and bookstore. Stories of adventure, friendship, and families that came together in unexpected ways. Mr. Buttons occupied a place of honor on Grace's desk, no longer a desperate comfort object, but a cherished reminder of her journey and resilience. Beside him sat other treasures: the friendship bracelet Lily had made for her, a photo from last Christmas morning surrounded by Martinez cousins, and the spelling bee trophy she had won the previous month with Carlos and Maria cheering from the audience. The first day of 5th grade at Lincoln Elementary had been a milestone that Grace had anticipated with excitement rather than anxiety. Walking into Mrs. Patterson's classroom, Mrs. Rodriguez had moved up to 4th grade.
but remained one of Grace's most trusted adults. Grace had introduced herself with quiet pride. "Hi, I'm Grace Martinez." No qualifications, no explanations about foster care or custody battles, just Grace Martinez, fifth grader, daughter, student, friend. The security in her own identity was remarkable for someone who had spent most of her childhood unsure of her own last name, or how long she would be staying in any particular placement. Her confidence extended beyond the classroom, into every aspect of her life. Grace joined the school's art club, tried out for the softball team, and participated in family gatherings with the easy comfort of someone who knew she belonged. The hypervigilance that had once characterized her interactions with adults had been replaced by the natural trust of a child who had learned that the people who said they loved her actually meant it. The evening routine that had once seemed too good to be true had become as natural as breathing. Grace would arrive home from school to find Maria preparing dinner in the kitchen, usually with ingredients Grace had helped select during their weekly grocery shopping trips. Carlos would emerge from his workshop with grease-stained hands and stories about the cars he was fixing, always interested in hearing about Grace's day and ready to help with homework or projects. On this particular evening, 6 months after the adoption ceremony, Grace stood beside Maria in the kitchen, learning to prepare enchiladas using Abuela Rosa's recipe, a skill that connected her to generations of Martinez family traditions. Her small hands worked carefully to roll the tortillas, while Maria guided her technique with the patient instruction of someone who understood that cooking together was about more than just preparing food. "Not too much filling, mija," Maria said gently, watching Grace work. "Just enough to taste good, not so much that it falls apart." From the living room came the sound of Carlos practicing guitar, his slightly off-key voice working through the Spanish ballads he had been teaching Grace to sing. The music created a backdrop of domestic contentment that would have seemed impossible during the darkest moments of the custody battle. Grace's internal monologue, as she worked beside Maria and listened to Carlos's music, reflected a wisdom that had been earned through years of uncertainty and 18 months of healing. She understood now the difference between being wanted for who you are and being wanted for what you represent. Marcus Sterling had wanted to own her story, to use her as a prop in his personal narrative of redemption and success. But Carlos and Maria wanted her, Grace with her love of art and fear of thunderstorms, her academic achievements and her occasional nightmares, her questions about everything and her fierce loyalty to the people who earned her trust. The family portrait that sat on the mantelpiece told better than any legal document or psychological evaluation could capture. In the most recent photo, taken at Christmas, Grace's smile was genuine and unguarded, not the careful, pleasing expression she had worn in earlier foster placements, but the radiant joy of someone who knew she was exactly where she belonged. As dinner preparations concluded and the family gathered around their kitchen table, Grace looked around at the faces of the people who had chosen her and whom she had chosen in return. Carlos said grace in Spanish, as he did every evening, his words of gratitude including specific thanks for the blessing of their complete family. Maria served the enchiladas Grace had helped prepare, praising her technique and promising to teach her Abuela Rosa's tamale recipe next week. The conversation that followed was filled with the ordinary details that made family life precious. Grace's excitement about her upcoming art show, Carlos's plans for building Grace a treehouse in the backyard, Maria's arrangements for Grace's sleepover with Lily the following weekend. These were the moments that Sterling's money could never have purchased, and his celebrity status could never have created. The simple, daily experiences of unconditional love that had healed Grace's trauma and given her the security to become exactly who she was meant to be. As Grace prepared for bed that night, following the ritual that had remained constant through every change and challenge of the past 2 years, she reflected on the journey that had brought her home. The foster care system had been designed to provide temporary safety while permanent families were located. But the Martinez family had given her something more valuable than permanency. They had given her belonging. Maria tucked Grace into bed with the same gentle care she had provided from their very first night together, reading from their current book and listening to Grace's prayers of gratitude for the life she had found. Carlos checked on her before heading to bed himself, their nightly conversation covering everything from school projects to dreams for the future. Grace Elizabeth Martinez fell asleep in her own bed, in her own room, in her own home, surrounded by the quiet sounds of a family at peace. She was no longer a foster child seeking placement or a legal case awaiting resolution. She was simply Grace, beloved daughter, trusted friend, promising student, and living proof that sometimes the families we choose are more powerful than the ones we're born into. The little girl who had once packed her belongings in a battered suitcase and learned not to get too attached to any placement had finally found her forever home. And in that home, surrounded by love that asked for nothing in return, except the privilege of caring for her, Grace Martinez slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that she would wake up tomorrow exactly where she belonged. In Grace's story, we witness something beautiful.
Unwavering loyalty of Ranger, Officer Thompson's German Shepherd partner, whose instincts cut through deception to protect an innocent child. Dogs possess an extraordinary gift for seeing truth in human hearts, sensing character in ways that transcend our human limitations. Ranger's protective devotion to Grace reminds us why these magnificent animals have earned their place as humanity's most trusted companions. German Shepherds, in particular, demonstrate an almost mystical ability to bond with those who need protection most, offering comfort that words cannot provide. The connection between humans and dogs runs deeper than companionship. It's a sacred trust built on mutual understanding, unconditional love, and shared purpose. Every dog owner knows those moments when their loyal friend seems to understand exactly what we need, offering silent support through life's challenges. If you've been touched by the bond between Grace and Ranger, you might find value in exploring resources that can deepen your own relationship with your four-legged family member. Sometimes, a gentle guide can help us unlock the full potential of these precious partnerships we cherish so deeply.